Gene Simmons, the demon, who needs no fake blood to be terrifying. On stage, he is the embodiment of evil. The black and white makeup, the impossibly long tongue, the fake blood gushing down his chest, and the strides that seem to swallow the world whole. But behind that demon mask, Gene Simmons is a living paradox, both a symbol of power and audacity, and proof of how fragile a man can be once the lights go out. On October 7, 2025, his name once again filled headlines, not for a tour, but for an accident in Malibu. He was rushed to the hospital after his SUV veered off and struck a parked car. According to his wife, Shannon Tweed, the incident happened because Simmons had been dehydrated and adjusting his medication, causing him to briefly lose consciousness. Fortunately, he recovered quickly and reassured fans it was just a minor bump. Yet the image of the 75-year-old man who once terrified millions with his superhuman presence, now lying inside an ambulance, left the world momentarily silent. Even the demon cannot escape the laws of humanity. From a poor immigrant boy carrying the scars of war, Gene Simmons rose to legend, building a music and merchandising empire worth hundreds of millions. He is not just a bassist, not merely the co-founder of Kiss. He is the man who forced the world to look at him, whether through music, scandal, or sheer arrogance. In an era when rock needed someone to blur the line between art and commerce, between idol and monster, Simmons was the first to do it, and he never once apologized. But who is he when the paint comes off? A misunderstood genius or a salesman wearing a rocker's skin? Gene Simmons' journey is that of a man born from the rubble of war, surviving by instinct and embracing hatred as the price of authenticity. For him, the audience's love is only a reward, but the right to exist on his own terms is the only kind of immortality that truly matters. Before the world knew the name Gene Simmons, the man with the monstrous tongue, the black and white makeup, and the thunderous bass, he was just an immigrant boy no one remembered, Chaim Witz. He was born on August 25, 1949, in Haifa, Israel, to a Hungarian Jewish family. His life began amid the ruins of war, in a small apartment overlooking the harbor, where his mother, Florence Klein, tried to rebuild from nothing. Florence carried wounds that time could never erase. She had been imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp, witnessing her parents, siblings, and the entire extended family murdered during the Holocaust. When the war ended, she was the only one left alive. Those memories never left her, and Gene grew up through nights when his mother woke up screaming through sighs heavier than any story she could tell. He would later say, "My mother never talked much about the past, but I could hear it in her silence." His father, Chaim Witz, was a carpenter, hard-working, but cold and unreliable. When Gene was 6, he walked out and never came back, leaving Florence and her son to survive in poverty. From that day, Gene grew up without a father figure. Years later, he would reflect, "I learned how to be a man by watching what men shouldn't do." In 1958, when Gene turned 8, his mother made a life-changing decision. She left Israel. The two of them boarded a ship across the Mediterranean, then a long flight to the United States, carrying a few belongings in a cloth suitcase, a bit of savings, and a fragile hope that America might give them another chance. They settled in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, a poor working-class neighborhood where immigrants crowded into crumbling apartments. Florence worked in a button factory and a sewing shop, taking night shifts to afford rent and food. Gene had no father, no friends, and no English, and he quickly learned that in America, pity was a luxury. Every school day was a battle. The boy once called Chaim Witz, now renamed Eugene, was mocked for his strange name, heavy Hebrew accent, and patched-up clothes. After school, he collected bottles for deposit refunds, sold used comic books, and worked at a grocery store to help his mother buy food. At night, The two of them shared a bowl of soup by the radio, as Gene listened to voices in a language he barely understood. It was during those lonely nights that he found refuge in a world where no one could hurt him, the world of monsters, superheroes, and rock music. He became obsessed with characters like Dracula, Frankenstein, Batman, and with bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Who. Not because they were famous, but because they were different. They didn't need approval to be great, and that taught Gene one lesson that would define his life. You don't have to be accepted to exist. He started learning guitar by ear, using fishing wire as strings and tape to hold the neck together. While his mother slept, Gene would quietly turn on the TV, write down song lyrics in a battered notebook, and teach himself English through music. Every song became a small fragment of freedom, something poverty could never take away. By high school, he began calling himself Eugene Klein, and later, Gene Simmons, a name that sounded like it came straight out of a comic book. But more than a name, it was a declaration. From the bullied boy, he became the one people feared. From invisible, he became impossible to ignore. And that was where the demon first began to take shape. Not in a recording studio, not under stage lights, but in the cold Brooklyn nights, when a lonely immigrant boy held his cheap guitar and whispered to himself, "One day, they'll know who I am." Gene Simmons didn't come to music as a dreamer. He entered it as a warrior. For him, music was never a sanctuary for fragile souls. It was a sword, the weapon he forged to cut through the chains of fate. It was how he would escape poverty, crush contempt, and build an empire no power could touch. That journey began when he was just 15, fumbling through school bands like Lynx and Missing Links. There was no money, no decent instruments, only an iron will. Gene ground his teeth and taught himself every chord, every rhythm, every grimace on stage. For a boy mocked for his immigrant roots, the stage was the only kingdom he could rule, a place where the world had no choice but to listen, whether it wanted to or not. In 1970, he graduated college with a bachelor's degree in education. Few know that before becoming the demon, Gene lived a double life. By day, a sixth-grade teacher. By night, an editorial assistant at glossy magazines like Vogue and Glamour. And when night fell, he would transform again, playing in cramped clubs for a few dollars, just enough to buy new guitar strings. Those jobs weren't about passion. They were training grounds for a lifelong war. By the late 60s, Gene joined forces with his creative ally Stanley Eisen, later known as Paul Stanley, to form Wicked Lester, a band that tried blending folk and psychedelic rock. They signed with Epic Records, recorded an album they thought would change their lives. But reality hit hard. The label coldly shelved the record, dismissing them with one brutal sentence: "There's nothing special about this band." That moment wasn't just a failure, it was an insult. Gene carved it into his memory like a burn scar and swore to himself, "Never again will anyone ever call me ordinary." From the ashes of Wicked Lester, Gene and Paul decided to start over. This time, they wouldn't just form a band, they would create a phenomenon. Gene sketched out a radical idea. Music should be a visual experience, the stage a battlefield, the musician a mythical creature. Fate answered their call. In 1973, they met Peter Criss, a scrappy Brooklyn drummer with a raspy voice, and Ace Frehley, an eccentric guitarist who played like lightning. Together, the four became Kiss, a name short, dangerous, and provocative, like a deadly kiss itself. From their very first show, they knew they had birthed something different. Kiss didn't just perform, they conducted a ritual. Fire, smoke, fake blood, and explosions choreographed to perfection. Gene crafted his persona, the demon, a white, emotionless face, eyes black as hell, and a tongue nearly 7 inches long, a raw symbol of power and desire. On stage, Gene Simmons ceased to exist. In his place stood a fire-breathing, blood-spewing monster from the deepest nightmare. The audience froze, half in fear, half in fascination. They couldn't look away. And that was exactly what Gene wanted, to be seared into their minds, even if through terror. While other rockers of the era preached about the purity of rock, Gene embraced a harsher truth. Art only matters if it buys the artist freedom. He saw money not as betrayal, but as the ultimate proof of survival. "If the soul can be sold," he once said, "then I'll be the first to auction mine. And I'll make sure I get the highest price." That cold, relentless philosophy turned the once poor immigrant boy into the master architect of a rock empire. One where every riff, every mask, every drop of blood was engineered for a single purpose: to make the demon and Kiss immortal. From the very beginning, Gene Simmons defined his role not just as a bassist, but as a world builder. When Kiss released their debut album Kiss in early 1974, Gene wrote or co-wrote 7 out of 10 tracks, including classics like Deuce, Cold Gin, and 100,000 Years. Though the record didn't make a big commercial splash at first, it laid the foundation for what would become the signature Kiss sound. Thick riffs, straightforward but effective tempos, and a clearly defined visual identity. Unlike many bands of the era still drifting between rock and blues, Gene pursued something raw, instinctive, and accessible, a kind of garage glam rock where the audience didn't have to understand every lyric. They only had to feel it in their muscles. By the end of 1974, Kiss released Hotter Than Hell, a heavier, dirtier, darker album. Here, Gene fully stepped into his demon persona with tracks like Parasite and especially Goin' Blind, a mid-tempo dirge about a 93-year-old man speaking to a 16-year-old girl, unsettling, seductive, and eerie, the perfect embodiment of Gene's twisted allure. With Dressed to Kill, 1975, Gene steered Kiss toward tight, punchy rock songs like She, Rock Bottom, and most importantly, Rock and Roll All Night. That song would soon become the national anthem of the Kiss Army, paving the way for the band's global domination. The studio version charted modestly, but the live version that followed would turn it into one of the most iconic anthems in American rock history. Yet because none of their first 3 albums achieved major commercial success, Gene, always the strategist, realized something crucial. For Kiss to become a phenomenon, they didn't just need good songs. They needed a lived experience. He understood that the band's greatest weapon wasn't in the studio, it was on stage. The turning point came in 1975 with the release of Alive, a live album that captured the wild energy no studio recording could. It didn't just save Kiss from bankruptcy, it became the living manifesto of Gene Simmons' philosophy. If rock and roll is a battlefield, Kiss doesn't play, they attack. As the demon, Gene led from the front like a commander who never retreats. He growled, breathed fire, spewed blood, and still played his bass with razor-sharp precision, as if the stage were an extension of his own body. After Alive, Gene pushed Kiss to record Destroyer, 1976, teaming up with renowned producer Bob Ezrin. The result was a surprisingly layered, sophisticated album that elevated Kiss from raw hard rock to near symphonic grandeur. Detroit Rock City became the legendary concert opener, while Beth, sung by Peter Criss, brought the band their first top 10 Billboard hit. But Gene was the soul of the record, from the thunderous bass of God of Thunder to his almost whispered vocals that sounded like a curse. Gene didn't play bass like a traditional musician. He pounded it like a second drummer, hitting where it needed to strike, dragging where it needed to grind, creating an animalistic pulse. His bass wasn't for showing off. It was for controlling the song's bloodstream. Tracks like Calling Dr. Love, Christine 16, and War Machine would later follow that same formula. Simple, heavy, snarling riffs that made you physically unable to sit still. Between 1976 and 1979, Gene Simmons wasn't just leading a band, he was commanding an invasion. He pushed Kiss into the pantheon once reserved for the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, a realm of artists who didn't just make music, but created culture. Each new album wasn't just a release, it was a shockwave. Stadiums turned into infernos, oceans of fans screamed as the demon erupted from smoke and blood, roaring in the language of hell. The rapid-fire assault on rock history. Rock and Roll Over, 1976. Love Gun, 1977. Alive 2, 1977. Every one of them went platinum, transforming Kiss into an unstoppable force. But even at the summit of the world, a gnawing hunger burned inside Gene Simmons. The demon's power wasn't enough. He wanted a kingdom of his own. In 1978, in a move as reckless as it was ambitious, all 4 members of Kiss released solo albums simultaneously. Among them, Gene Simmons stood tallest, climbing to the top of the Billboard charts and featuring unlikely collaborators like Cher, Donna Summer, and Joe Perry. It wasn't just music, it was a declaration of dominance. Gene Simmons wasn't just the heart of Kiss. He was a planet with his own orbit, capable of shining alone. A year later, he detonated another bomb within his own fan base. In 1979, Kiss released Dynasty with the hit, I Was Made for Lovin' You, a disco-infused track, the sworn enemy of rock purists. Outrage followed. Fans cried betrayal. But Gene saw what others didn't, survival. To him, the enemy wasn't disco, it was stagnation. The song cracked open new markets worldwide, pushing Kiss beyond America's borders. Gene didn't even sing lead, but he was the one who approved the gamble, with one unshakable belief. A band only truly dies when it stops evolving. Behind the makeup and the pyrotechnics, Gene was the ruthless chief architect of the empire. He wasn't just the demon on stage. He was a CEO without a title in the boardroom. He designed Kiss's entire machinery: albums, tours, merchandise, licensing. Every move was calculated with military precision. Kiss was no longer just a band, it was a brand, a closed ecosystem where even the air could be monetized. This was the full portrait of power. On stage, beneath fire and smoke, Gene Simmons was the demon. Primal, feral, unrestrained. But when the curtain fell in the quiet of the meeting room, he was the only one who could hear the heartbeat of the empire's cash flow. The deadly fusion of a beast's instinct and a strategist's mind didn't just keep Kiss alive, it turned them into a global war machine, shattering every limitation of what a hard rock band could be. By the 1980s, the empire began to tremble. Disco faded, punk and new wave rose, and Kiss's sound started to feel outdated to younger audiences. Revenues dropped. Unmasked, 1980, was criticized as too soft, and tours no longer sold out. Facing the storm, Gene, who had always seen music as a survival battle, knew they needed to shed their skin. In 1983, Kiss shocked the world by removing their makeup and revealing their real faces on MTV for the first time. For Gene, it wasn't surrender, it was strategy. When the old symbol begins to decay, break it and be reborn. As Kiss searched for their footing in the 80s, Gene diversified. He ventured into film and television, appearing in Runaway, 1984, with Tom Selleck, Trick or Treat, 1986, and Wanted Dead or Alive, 1987. None of the roles won him awards, but they reinforced his image as the man who refuses to stand still. He also dabbled in production and artist management, guiding younger acts and overseeing commercial projects under the Kiss brand. While Paul Stanley kept the fire burning on stage, Gene became the strategist, silently ensuring the machine kept running. By the 1990s, the tide turned again. As nostalgia for classic rock surged, Gene seized the moment with the instincts of a master businessman. Massive tours returned. Albums like Revenge, 1992, and Psycho Circus, 1998, revived their sound. But the real explosion came in 1996 when the original lineup, Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Ace Frehley, Peter Criss, reunited in full makeup for the Alive Worldwide Tour. Spanning nearly 2 years, it grossed over $140 million, restoring Kiss to the throne once more. Parallel to music, Gene expanded his presence into global media. He appeared on talk shows, wrote books, Sex Money Kiss, and shaped his persona as the entrepreneur inside a rock star's body. In 2006, he launched the reality series Gene Simmons' Family Jewels, which ran until 2012, showing life behind the mask, a Gene who was witty, pragmatic, sometimes brutally cold. The show became a pop culture phenomenon, expanding his influence beyond music into business, branding, and entertainment. In 2014, Kiss was finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a long overdue but deserved honor. Despite decades of internal conflict and ongoing debates about their artistic merit, no one could deny the impact Gene and Paul had made. They turned rock into a visual language and a band into a timeless institution. As the world evolved and rock receded from the mainstream, Gene Simmons never stopped moving. In 2020, he and Paul Stanley launched the End of the Road tour, announcing it would be Kiss's final farewell after half a century of dominance. Despite pandemic delays, the band persisted, performing across continents, each night a festival of fire, smoke, and memory. On December 2, 2023, at Madison Square Garden, New York, Kiss played their final show amid tears and thunderous applause. When the giant screen went dark and the demon bowed one last time, Gene Simmons didn't just close a chapter of rock, he closed an entire era. But true to his nature, he declared afterward, "Kiss will never die. We're just evolving into another form." And so, even after the lights fade, Gene Simmons remains, the man who turned rock into an empire and himself into an immortal symbol of power, ambition, and survival. So when people ask who was truly the soul of Kiss, whether you love him or hate him, the answer is, undeniably, Gene Simmons. When the stage lights went out, Gene Simmons didn't take off the demon mask. He carried it with him, stepping into real life as if the entire world were just an extension of his stage. For Gene, there was no line between performance and reality. Every word, every gesture, every move was part of the brand that bore his name. But that same commitment to his persona often turned his private life into a storm, where flashbulbs and applause could no longer conceal the cracks of the man beneath. Controversy, criticism, and scandal followed him like unending waves. Beginning in 1983, Gene started a relationship with Shannon Tweed, a Canadian model and actress, one of the defining sex symbols of the 1980s. They lived together, raised children, and appeared arm in arm at every event. Yet Gene stubbornly refused to marry. He declared marriage to be a legal trap, a tool of control, and something that a man like me would never need. The statement divided the public. Some admired his brutal honesty, while others saw it as proof of his ego and his lifelong fear of emotional commitment. It didn't stop there. Gene proudly claimed he had slept with over 4,800 women, and, shockingly, that he had kept a photograph of each one as a form of personal record. To him, it was a symbol of masculine freedom. To the public, a grotesque act of objectification. Critics accused him of commodifying sex and reducing people to statistics. Even Shannon Tweed, after decades by his side, told him on national television, "You're addicted to yourself, and you think the world exists to serve you." Then came the true reckoning. In 2010, a sex tape leaked online showing Simmons with a female fan in a hotel room. The scandal made international headlines, destroying his carefully controlled image and pushing his 27-year relationship with Shannon to the breaking point. On their reality show, Gene Simmons' Family Jewels, Shannon packed her bags and left, delivering one line that silenced him completely. "You can't have everything. You can't want me and still live like a single man with no limits." For the first time, the demon had nothing to say. No script, no audience, only consequences. In October 2011, at age 62, Gene Simmons did the one thing he once swore he'd never do. He walked down the aisle and placed a wedding ring on Shannon Tweed's hand. The woman who had waited 28 years finally saw the man who once declared himself untouchable surrender to love. Their marriage wasn't just the end of a love story. It was the only time the demon ever surrendered. Together they have 2 children, Nick, born 1989, and Sophie, born 1992. Both chose gentler artistic paths than their father. Nick became a writer and comic book artist with a dark, surreal style, while Sophie pursued music and reality TV. Through Gene Simmons' Family Jewels, 2006-2012, audiences saw another side of Gene, awkward, clumsy, sometimes tender. A man learning how to be a father after spending his life mastering how to be the demon. But even with a stable home life, Gene never escaped his own recklessness. He repeatedly drew outrage for comments deemed arrogant and insensitive. On poverty, he said bluntly, "If you're poor, it's your fault. You're lazy, you don't try. Don't blame anyone else." And on depression, "If you think life is meaningless, go ahead and kill yourself. I don't need to hear you whining." Those remarks ignited firestorms. Mental health organizations and suicide prevention groups condemned him for trivializing psychological suffering. Fox News, a network where he frequently appeared, issued a lifetime ban, calling it permanent and irreversible. Even within KISS, Gene was never easy to deal with. For years, he clashed with Ace Frehley and Peter Criss, particularly over money and creative control. Frehley once remarked, "Gene Simmons is the CEO of KISS, not our bandmate." Criss was harsher. "He controls everything, even your breathing, and if you don't obey, you're replaced." These tensions lasted decades, making every reunion and breakup after 2000 tense and short-lived. Fans longed to see the original lineup again, but Gene stood firm. To him, the brand outweighed friendship, and that belief ensured that while KISS may be immortal, it would forever carry an unhealed fracture at its core. In 2017, he provoked yet another storm when he tried to trademark the devil horn's hand gesture, an iconic symbol of heavy metal culture popularized by Ronnie James Dio in the 1970s. Gene filed an application with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, claiming the gesture as his intellectual property. The rock community erupted in outrage. Wendy Dio, Ronnie's widow, fired back, "It's an insult to my husband's memory and a shameless act of disrespect." Facing global backlash, Gene quietly withdrew the application after just a few days, without apology, without explanation. For one of the few times in his life, the demon retreated. And that moment marked the first visible crack in the iron statue he had spent half a century forging. The man who seemed incapable of being wrong, finally forced to bow before the world he once conquered. When KISS closed out more than half a century on the road with the End of the Road tour at the end of 2023, many assumed that at 74, Gene Simmons would retreat from the stage and find a quiet corner to become a retired old demon. But Gene has never been the type to disappear in silence. For him, rest isn't in the dictionary, only evolution. Stepping into 2024, Gene revived the Gene Simmons Band, a solo project he had shelved for years. The band hit major rock festivals around the world, most notably Summer Breeze Festival in São Paulo, Brazil, where he still breathed fire, roared, and thumped the bass as if time had never passed. In 2025, when many thought he'd slow down, Gene proved the opposite. He announced a spring North American tour, but 17 of 26 dates were postponed to 2026 due to logistical issues. Rather than treating it as a setback, Gene used the gap to launch a bold new idea: the ultimate Gene Simmons experience. Priced at nearly $2,500, fans didn't just meet Gene. They became his personal stage assistant for a day, prepping costumes, checking gear, having dinner, and even stepping on stage to perform. More than a marketing gimmick, it was Gene's way of dissolving the line between idol and audience, turning fandom into lived experience, making fans feel they weren't just watching a legend, but living inside his world. A form of instinctive, quintessentially Gene Simmons marketing, cool-headed, precise, but never heartless. Beyond music, Gene continued to run his life like a rock entrepreneur. In 2025, he listed his Beverly Hills home, a glass, wood, and steel residence valued near $14 million, and moved with Shannon Tweed to Malibu. In an interview, he said, "I used to think the bigger the better, but now I need space to be quiet, to remember who I am when no one's looking." It sounded like a rare moment of calm, but for someone like Gene, even quiet is a strategy. In November of the same year, Kiss were confirmed for a special return in Las Vegas at Kiss Army Storms Vegas, marking the 50th anniversary of the Kiss Fan Club, their first performance since Farewell, this time without makeup. And while it looked like a night of nostalgia, in reality, it was the next step in Gene's post-immortality strategy, keeping Kiss alive, even without blood, fire, or black and white paint. Earlier, in April 2024, Kiss sold their entire music catalog and brand to Pop House Entertainment for an estimated $300 million. Soon after, Gene declared, "Kiss will not die, only change shape." He teamed up with Industrial Light and Magic to develop avatar performance technology, bringing Kiss back to the stage in digital form, slated for 2027. For Gene, this wasn't just the future. It was how you make immortality real. And though 2025 had its turbulence, especially the Malibu car accident in October when he briefly lost consciousness while driving and hit a parked car, Gene got back up faster than the rumors. Just days later, he posted a terse update. "Just a minor bump. The demon is fine," as if to remind the world that demons don't sleep. As for legacy, Gene Simmons won't be remembered for virtuosic solos or techniques that made critics bow. He leaves something far rarer in rock history, a persona, unmistakable, irreplaceable. Musically, Simmons distilled heavy to its essence, turning compact, slow, rough riffs into the crowd's primal roar. In an era when rock grew complex and drifted from the masses, he kept Kiss's sound close, chantable, and explosive. Not out of laziness, but because Gene understood. Rock isn't for analysis, it's for detonation. On stage, he embodies total transformation, not playing music, but becoming music. The demon isn't a role, it's Gene's primal instinct set free under the lights. Through him, the rock show stopped being mere sound and became a ritual. Blood spurting, tongue unfurling, fire blazing, and the crowd howling like worshippers at a newly minted myth. In branding terms, no one in hard rock has carried the mindset of a cultural empire CEO quite like Gene Simmons. He didn't just build a band, he built a world, a place where every product, from soda cans and toys to coffins, bears the Kiss logo. And every kid painting their face in black and white isn't just mimicking artists. They're inhabiting a pop religious icon. Of course, not everyone loves Gene. Part of his legacy is arrogance, coldness, and a willingness to trade friendship for vision. But sometimes that's exactly what kept him from dissolving into the background, in a world where many stars live long but die quiet. In the end, Gene Simmons's legacy doesn't lie in songs, images, or merchandise, but in a stubborn belief. If you're different enough, durable enough, and tough enough, you don't need to be loved to become immortal. There will never be a humble Gene Simmons. He didn't write music to soothe pain, nor step on stage seeking empathy. He entered the world of rock as a conqueror, carrying a razor-sharp ego, a mind that never stopped calculating, and one core belief carved into his soul. In a noisy world, being different is the only ticket to being remembered. People have called him an opportunist, a salesman in a rocker's disguise, a narcissist who loves only himself. They may be right, but there's a greater truth that no one can deny. Gene Simmons turned a band into a cultural empire, a mask into a form of faith, and the hatred thrown at him into fuel to keep his fire burning forever. He may not be the greatest artist, nor the most virtuous man, yet his life stands as the most ruthless and most honest lesson about the entertainment industry. Sometimes, to avoid being devoured by the world, you must accept being misunderstood, even hated. And that lesson leaves us with one final question. To you, is Gene Simmons a singular legend, a ruthless opportunist, or a reflection of both? This debate will never end, and we truly want to hear your thoughts. If you found this video compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.